Hello and welcome, everybody. You are at the session entitled Against the Singularity Hypothesis with David Thorstad. I am your MC for this session. My name is Andy Runyon. Following David's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where David will respond to your questions. You can submit those questions through the swap card live discussion feature. And then after about 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. But for now, I would like to introduce your speaker. David Thorstad is an assistant professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt University, senior research affiliate at the Global Priorities Institute in Oxford, and research affiliate at the Mint Lab, Australian National University. Without further ado, David, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Andy. There's been, I think, emerging concern recently about developments in artificial intelligence, and one of the stronger concerns has been that they could pose a catastrophic threat to humanity. So here by existential catastrophe, let's just use Bostrom's definition as good as any other. He means extinction or close, premature extinction of Earth-originating life, or permanent drastic destruction of our potential to develop in desirable ways. Now, there's lots of arguments that people give for this concern, but I think one of the better known arguments is best associated with Nick Bostrom and with Eliezer Yudkowsky. And this argument has three premises. The first is going to be the premise I'm talking about today, is often called the singularity hypothesis. Bostrom doesn't like this name, but I think this is very much what he's defending. And the idea here is that artificial intelligence will be able to improve itself if it can't already. And then once that happens, it will grow faster and faster because it can make itself better and better at a faster and faster rate. And that's going to continue until AI has become not just more intelligent, but many orders of magnitude more intelligent than humanity. I think classically, the first statement of this is usually credited to I.J. Good in 1966. Good says, let a super intelligent machine just be any machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any human, however clever. Well, designing machines is one of those activities, so an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably, okay, he shouldn't have said unquestionably, there would then maybe be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of humanity would be left far behind. And the argumentative upshot of the singularity hypothesis is supposed to be that motivations are all that matter. If we can work with a machine that's orders of magnitude more intelligent than humanity, there's really no question of what it could do to us. The question is what it would like to do to us. So that's why you see Bostrom and Yudkowsky focusing on, most of their argument on the following premises. The first is just an in-principle claim about motivations. It gets called orthogonality. It says intelligence, final goals, they're just orthogonal axes, and possible agents can vary freely along these axes. Just about any level of intelligence can be combined with just about any final goal. There's nothing incoherent about an AI who wants to help us, and there's nothing incoherent about an AI that doesn't want to help us. Okay, but then, that's just the in-principle argument. In practice, what is a super intelligent agent going to like? And here we get the instrumental convergence claim. So the claim is that some instrumental values like power, like money, like resources are convergent in the sense that they'll increase your chance of getting whatever you want, almost no matter what you want. You want to be famous, power helps. You want to be left alone, power helps. You want a lot of compute power, power helps. You want to turn off all the computers, power helps. Implying, I've picked on this word implying before, but let's leave it alone for now, implying that these values are going to be pursued. If power helps you get your goals, you're going to want power. And so that's the thought, is an AI is going to want to take power. And if it's radically super intelligent, it's probably going to get it, and that'll be bad news for humanity. I think especially in my discipline in philosophy, we hear a lot about orthogonality. We're starting to hear more about instrumental convergence. Surprisingly, we don't hear that much pushback on the singularity hypothesis. And so I just wanted to write up, as it were, some reasons somebody might be skeptical of the singularity hypothesis here. So the full paper, I've given you a link, or you can just Google it. It's open access, so you can go to the journal website and get it. But basically, I want to clarify what the singularity hypothesis is, and I want to give you some preliminary reasons to be skeptical of the singularity hypothesis. Off stage, the second half of the paper is, of course, going to look at some leading defenses of the singularity hypothesis, Nick Bostrom, Dave Chalmers, and I'm going to argue they don't do enough. And then off stage, I'll draw some implications. But I think the implication we stressed here might be the most relevant for the current audience is just that this figures prominently in some existential risk arguments. Okay, we got to be really careful to clarify the singularity hypothesis. I've often gotten some revisionist history. You criticize a view and people say, oh, no, we didn't say that. And so I think it's really important to pin people down here, and I'll give you evidence that they said the things they said. I think best scholarly practice when you need a definition is look at the very first anthology on the subject. The editors did their job. They asked the contributors, what do you think? And they just wrote down in the editorial introduction, here's what a singularity hypothesis is. It's got to be three things. And so I'm just writing down, what the first anthology said this was. First, you're going to give me a quantity. We're focusing on AI, but there's also a singularity with economic growth that we're not focusing on today. And you're going to make a claim about that quantity, namely, well, it's going to grow. Of course, it's going to grow. It's going to grow faster and faster and faster. And that this growth is going to continue until we reach a fundamental discontinuity in history. This is supposed to be a big deal. The singularity is meant to imply an analogy to crossing the event horizon of a singularity or a black hole, that this is going to be so radically transformative, we cannot understand before we cross it what it's going to be like. Okay, so that's what singularity hypotheses are in general. When I tell you which one I'm talking about, I need to tell you what's the quantity, what's accelerating growth, and what kind of a discontinuity are we growing towards. The quantity, I'm just going to follow I.J. Good and assume we're talking about general intelligence of artificial agents. I know some people don't like to talk about general intelligence, and Dave Chalmers gave us a pretty good way to write that out of the argument if you want to talk about that, but I'm fine talking about general intelligence for now. Accelerating growth, we need to be very careful to specify what we mean. So obviously some slow growth modes like logarithmic growth is pretty common. That's not accelerating. Linear growth, that's not accelerating. There's one and only one person in this literature, namely Dave Chalmers, who said exponential growth is accelerating. That's a very uncommon claim because in relative terms, it's not. Exponential growth is, 4%, 4%, 4%. It's not 4%, 5%, 7%, 10%. So, people like Bostrom and Yudkowsky are explicitly going to write down hyperbolic growth, and that's where the percentage rate of growth is itself increasing. And of course, this is a quite fast form of growth, and in particular, it heads towards an asymptote in finite time. You really do need this. I guess one illustration would be GDP. People who talk about an economic singularity do not mean, well, we've had economic growth being exponential for 200 years. They mean a much faster mode of growth than this. This was impressive, but this isn't quite fast enough to get you the singularity concerns. And crucially, you don't just need fast growth for a while. Think about maybe the only good example in nature of a hyperbola is nuclear chain reactions grow this fast. But within, much less than a second, they start growing like this and they bottom out. Why did they bottom out? Well, you burned all the resources and then, you got nothing to burn. And this is a very common thing to happen to growth modes. So if you think about population panics last century, we had exponential, some people thought briefly hyperbolic growth in world population, and people said, how are we going to feed all these people? But it turns out that's very easy. Population growth is now going, the route of the logistic growth. By about 2070, 2080, everybody thinks it's going to flatline and start declining. So what the singularity folks need, they need fast growth, by which it probably means hyperbolic growth, and they need it for a long time before it bottoms out. Okay, what kind of a discontinuity are we talking here? Here I'm going to give you direct quotes, so nobody can say they didn't say it. Most people are going for orders of magnitude in intelligence above humanity. Dave Chalmers says we're going as far beyond the most intelligent human as that human goes beyond a mouse. Loosemore and Gertzel is again the 2012 anthology, says we're going 2 or 3 orders of magnitude greater than humans. Again, not 2 or 3 times, 100 or 1,000 times. Yudkowsky says we're going minds orders of magnitude more powerful than the human. Kurzweil I won't read. Kurzweil tends to make much, much, much stronger claims than this, but I don't want to pin everybody to Kurzweil. So when I was reading about this, I was hoping to read something that was roughly when you send a paper on the singularity to a journal and they reject it at the editor's desk, like what is the editor thinking when they say, many academics are skeptical of this claim? And I was kind of looking for some ordinary, not crazy, not super controversial statements of why people tend to be worried about this. And I thought somebody would have written them down, but nobody did. So I just wrote this paper to write them down. I don't think any of this is particularly original, but hopefully it's a little bit less out of left field than some of the arguments you'll get here. And just the first thing to say is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you think about hyperbolic growth, we've seen it maybe like once in nature with nuclear chain reactions. Maybe somebody's got another example. We've never seen hyperbolic growth sustained for a long time in nature. It's just too fast to be sustained like that. And so it's, of course, physically possible that we could have a singularity, but you're really going to need quite a lot of evidence for positing a growth rate like that, because when we write down models, this is not usually the kind of a model we write. If you were to talk to economists and you were to say, why do you tend to be skeptical of the singularity? Someone like Nordhaus, maybe, they're going to talk about diminishing research productivity. And here the analogy is something like fishing. Sorry, I know many of you think this is a moral travesty, but this is the example everybody uses. So just imagine you're fishing from a pond and you're not fishing and releasing, you're fishing and cooking and fishing and cooking. What happens? Well, at first it's really easy to catch fish. Some of them are hungry, some of them are dumb. But then you catch those fish, it gets harder and harder and harder to catch fish. Why? Not because you got any worse at fishing. You probably got better. It's just because, the fish that are left are harder to catch. So we could put this in terms of diminishing fishing productivity. Every input, say an hour spent fishing, gives you fewer and fewer outputs, say fish over time. And economists think that research is like fishing for ideas. You catch the low-hanging fruit or the high-hanging fish, then the medium-hanging fruit, and then the harder-hanging fruit, and it gets harder and harder and harder to make new discoveries, not because you got dumber, but because the discoveries are now harder to make, or a bit more formally, after a point, in most sectors, actually, of the American economy today, you're going to have every time you put in an additional research input, like a quality weighted research hour, it's going to get fewer and fewer outputs. So, some headline examples of this, but there's plenty of others in the literature. This is, the mean opinion. Most people think this is true most of the time. If you look at medical research, something like FDA approval for drugs, back in the 50s, inflation adjusted, you could get about 40 drugs for $1 billion. Back in the penicillin days, it wasn't too hard to make new drug discoveries, but then we found all those drugs. Now it costs more than $1 billion to get a drug, and part of that is regulation, but a lot of it is just we need to do more to find drugs that we haven't already found. Likewise, agricultural productivity has been wonderful. That's how we're feeding all those new people. We had a massive growth in industrial agricultural productivity, but then it started slowing down. So even if you just look at, a 2-decade period in developed countries, we kept throwing money at the problem, 60% more adjusted for inflation. But that wasn't even enough to keep our growth rate constant of crop yields. And the problem is like, look, you invented the tractor, that was great. Inventing GMOs was harder. The next thing you invent is going to be less good and harder to find. It's just you found the tractor already and it's harder. The application, of course, is AI research, us improving AI improving AI is a research process. Most economists think most research processes get diminishing returns eventually. So, you should think this one gets diminishing returns eventually. You've got an AI improving itself. It gets harder and harder and harder to improve itself. And even if the researcher, namely AI, gets smarter, it's also just got a rapidly escalating problem in terms of, problem difficulty. And when you draw this out, that usually pinches you quite a lot. Now, sometimes people say to me, like, David, what about Moore's law? Wasn't that accelerating, growth in AI? I think there's obviously some quick things to say. That was growth in hardware, not growth in intelligence, and it wasn't accelerating. That was exponential, not hyperbolic. Nobody ever thought we were going to get hyperbolic growth in hardware. But the main thing to say is actually this is the star example of diminishing research productivity, by which I mean I'm citing the latest, greatest American Economic Review paper on diminishing research productivity, and their headline example is Moore's law. So they say across about 40 or 50 year period, we did have doubling and doubling and doubling of transistor counts every 2 years. But their best estimate is we had an 18-fold drop in semiconductor research productivity, and their estimates range up to about a 500-fold drop. So right, what we have is 35% growth every year is going to get you doubling every 2 years. But the research inputs needed to get 35% growth are just going up and up and up and up. It costs $10 billion to make a semiconductor factory now. That's a lot. And precisely because it's costing more and more and more to sustain this trend, there's two views on Moore's law. There's expert view number one, is it ended around 2020, and there's expert view number two, is it's going to end by about 2030. But nobody thinks we can keep this up indefinitely. We can't be spending $10 trillion on a semiconductor plant, or $10 quadrillion on a semiconductor plant. So I think that's, the main reason people are concerned is just we expect a diminishing returns scheme. And, someone like Bostrom's actually just going to write down the equation for an accelerating returns scheme. And that's surprising a lot of people. Bottlenecks this is again coming from the economists, is like, look, you're trying to speed up or improve a process. You want to speed it up 2 times, 3 times. You can speed up some parts and not others. But you want to speed it up 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times. You really got to speed up every part about 1,000,000 times or 1,000,000,000 times. Otherwise, that one pesky bit that you didn't speed up is just going to bottleneck you until you do. And the problem is there are a lot of feasible bottlenecks. If you're trying to improve AI, by a factor of 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 in 5 or 10 years, what are you going to run out of? Energy. You see people massively bidding already for energy contracts, trying to get cold fusion, and even that's not going to get us 1,000,000,000 times more energy. Resources, it takes resources to build chips, and we can only mine them so fast. Hardware assembly, even if we had the money to keep building semiconductor plants, we can't just build 1,000,000,000 times more plants overnight, or maybe in a while. Heat dissipation's hard. The game of doubling and doubling and doubling the density of chips is no longer a great game because we're getting pretty close to frying our chips, and that's going to take a while to get around. And then not just bottlenecks. Of course, on a very, very long time horizon, everything looks like a bottleneck. But, on the time horizon we're operating on, some things look a little more like hard physical constraints. There's only so many resources on Earth to build chips out of and make energy out of. And things like transistor size, you're about the size of an atom right now is the size of a transistor. And there's just only so much smaller you can make things before it gets very, very, very hard. Finally, remember, we're talking about intelligence growth, not, hardware growth or software growth. And it's not, I think, something we should take it as a given that if we have constant or accelerating growth in, say, hardware, we also get constant or accelerating growth in intelligence. And in particular, this is the only place where I kind of have to ask the person I'm speaking to what they mean by intelligence. You can tell me anything you mean as long as it does, what it's supposed to do in the argument. Pretty much anything I can think of as a natural correlate of intelligence does not grow linearly in hardware, it grows log linearly in hardware. And if that's right, exponential growth in hardware doesn't even get you exponential growth in intelligence. Hyperbolic in hardware gets you exponential in intelligence, and hyperbolic in intelligence, God knows what you need to get that. So you can look, for example, at gameplay, chess or Go. You have exponential improvement in compute over the years, giving you linear improvement in ELO ratings. All the big money problem solving, like protein folding, like oil well detection, you have exponential compute capacity changes, giving you linear accuracy of these problems. Maybe a very good example is weather prediction. Doesn't matter if you're looking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days out. On the bottom axis, we have exponential increases over time in compute power. And on the top, we have predictive error, and we're getting linear improvements in predictive error out of exponential improvements in compute power. So if that's right, even, say, hyperbolic growth in hardware, which I don't think anybody expects anytime soon, would not get you a singularity style dynamic in intelligence. Okay, just a brief recap before we turn over to questions. So we're looking today at the singularity hypothesis, which is positing hyperbolic growth. I mean, Dave Chalmers said exponential growth, but I don't think exponential growth is going to get these folks what they want. Certainly, Bostrom-Yudkowsky said hyperbolic growth in general intelligence, and we're getting sustained growth in general intelligence until we have an agent orders of magnitude more intelligent than humanity. That's scary. If I believed that, I would quit my job and be an AI safety researcher right now. I think there are some reasons for preliminary doubt about this. Namely, it's just a very strong claim and it's going to need very, very strong evidence. In general, we're in a diminishing research productivity regime, which tends to bite you pretty hard. And especially when someone like Bostrom just writes down an increasing, research productivity regime, I think that should worry you a little bit. Bottlenecks tend to pinch if you're trying to grow really hard, really fast, and they're already starting to pinch. If you work for an AI company, you probably have seen this.
Great. Should we go ahead and jump in with the Q&A, or do you want to finish up what you're talking about?
I just finished. That was literally it. So yeah, singularity hypothesis, not sure about it. Might want to try something else, but I will take questions and that's the end.
Awesome. I'm glad we were able to get through your presentation before all that. Great. So let's go ahead and jump in with the questions. We got a few in here in the chat. Um, Supposing AI intelligence does follow sigmoid growth or tan growth rather than hyperbolic growth, that would imply there will be no intelligence singularity. Do you think that supports a reduction in concern about AI, or would we need to talk about where the top of the ton could be in the intelligence range to understand the possible threat?
I think it motivates a different kind of a concern about AI. So the initial Yudkowsky-Bostrom worry was, look, we don't really think about how AI is going to manage to take power from us. We just need to think about what it's going to want, and that's it. And we get stories like, oh, well, it'll be very intelligent, so it'll solve some problems in biology, and it'll make nanobots, it'll send them out, it'll do the James Bond Spectre thing, and just, we'll all drop dead. And that style of argument is not going to work so well without the singularity. And I think that's why you've seen a lot of people shift towards power seeking arguments, because the thought there is meant to be that we could make more empirically grounded arguments that wouldn't rely on the singularity. Just there's going to be a little bit more pressure to get empirical grounding for those arguments because we can't, go with instrumental convergence and say it's going to want power, but then we're also going to need to say a lot about how our machine's going to get power.
Great. Let's go to the next question. How should we as EAs approach Pascal's mugging style scenarios in light of the substantial skepticism you argue we should have about the plausibility of some of these scenarios, including but not limited to the singularity? In the case of the singularity, do you think the skepticism you argue for is significant enough that the stakes become insignificant relative to their probability?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, and I think it's really important. Something that I do not do that I think many critics of EA do is say, here's the one and only one trick, and if you do this trick, long-termism is false, and you don't have to worry about AI. As academics, we rarely think there's one trick that gets rid of anything. We think, there's many different things to talk about, and they add up to either support or non-support for the argument. So I often get this objection. People will say, David, you made this argument about existential risk that is 10 orders of magnitude less important than I thought it was, but maybe I thought it was already better than everything else by 20 orders of magnitude. And they say, David, what do you say about that? And the answer is I say something else. So, one thing that anyone can take from this away from this is just increased skepticism about the singularity. But depending on where you're starting, you might want to pile on other skepticism. So like one thing I've really wanted to emphasize is the ways that we estimate, say, the value of existential risk mitigation can often really drive the numbers up to, more. And just when we start making arguments like that and start chaining them together, I'm going to call this in my book the shedding zero strategy. You might run out of orders of magnitude pretty quickly.
Next question is, isn't economic growth over the last 100,000 years hyperbolic?
Um, that's a bit misleading. We were in a regime of almost nothing called economic growth, and then a little bit, and then a lot. So yes, it's hyperbolic, but not in the sense of like accelerating growth feeding on itself. Like the growth feeding on itself is exponential growth feeding on itself, and this is a 200-year phenomenon. So of course, like mathematically, it's a hyperbola, but we really had like nothing, nothing, nothing. Of course, mathematically, it would have been a hyperbola if we started before human history and had it at zero for a while. But that's maybe not, I think, the right way to put it. And in particular, like, that hasn't convinced most economists that we're going to see hyperbolic growth in the future. I don't think you have many growth projections that are hyperbolic.
Next question. It seems like the quotes you pulled out, intelligence orders of magnitudes more than humans are about the level of intelligence rather than the shape of the growth curve. If the growth is logarithmic, but doesn't reach the diminishing returns until 100x human intelligence, then does it matter?
Yeah. So, I had a referee push me on this too. Yeah, I gave you quotations about the magnitude of discontinuity, but not the speed. So first, let me say why the speed matters, and then I'll give you some quotations. So two reasons speed matters. First, even Bostrom says it matters. So Bostrom says very clearly in his discussion of the kinematics of an intelligence explosion, or maybe it's chapter 5. Right after that, he says, I think fast takeoff would be very hard to survive because we can't adapt. I think slow or medium takeoff and slow or medium takeoff mean, not even that slow, mean humanity has time to adapt and would do a lot better. So even the standard Bostrom view is we'd have time to adapt. But the other reason they matter is because they're going to bear on the importance of existential risk mitigation now. So, if you have a view in which superintelligent AI might emerge in 1,000 years or 5,000 years, you're not going to be urging young, effective altruists to start mitigating existential risk from AI now. You're going to be going back to the old paradigm of, feed the poor, cure the sick. And so it's going to matter in an action relevant way. Give me just a minute to see if I can pull up some quotes because they really did say this, and I have in one of my letters to a referee, I have literally like 10 quotations. So we're looking at revise and resubmit number 3. Uh, okay, it should be just 10 seconds. I don't want to take too long, but I think it's important to get some evidence here. So we have, okay, so we're looking at what I sent to BJPS. I think it is revise and resubmit number 2.
It's always two, huh?
Okay, there we are. So yeah. Um, so the Bostrom quote I just gave you, he says, I'm going to present some reasons for thinking slow transitions improbable. If and when a takeoff occurs, it'll be explosive. And he goes on to say he's arguing for that because he thinks slow and medium are survivable. Um, let's see. So the Rudman model, open fill, a colleague of mine called it fitting the closest hyperbola. I'm looking at every model run of his model was a hyperbola. Kurzweil says the word exponential, but doesn't mean the word exponential. And he says things like exponentially exponential growth, which sound awfully like a hyperbola. So he does say exponential. I don't think he means it. Let's see. Yudkowsky says a positive feedback cycle goes boom like a chain of nuclear fissions gone critical. That's hyperbolic. Every intelligence improvement triggering an average of greater than 1 further improvements of similar magnitude. That's hyperbolic. Werner Vinge says developments thought to happen only in 1,000,000 years will happen in the next century. Somewhere else he says a blink of the eye. I can get you more if you email me, but people really did say this, and I think people really do need to be held to what they said.
Great. Let's see. Next question. Under what conditions would you become less skeptical? You mentioned that if you thought the singularity hypothesis was correct, you'd quit your job and become an AI safety researcher. I
Yeah.
recently did quit my job to pivot to AI policy and governance. I'd like to hear you share what signals or hallmarks you would be keeping an eye out over the next
Yeah.
few years that would cause you to reevaluate.
So on the singularity, it's really simple. I would be scared by signs of hyperbolic growth. Namely, if the acceleration, if the rate of growth of AI speeds up, that's scary. If things like scaling laws, maybe they're slowing down, that would be less scary. Um, I take it the question was also maybe are there things other than the singularity that would scare me. Yeah, what would scare me? Power-seeking behavior, explicit power-seeking behavior would scare me. Just generally increasing capacities would scare me. Near misses would scare me. Lack of regulatory concern would scare me. Bad people owning AI would scare me. These are all things that would start to frighten me, I think.
Next question. It seems that you wouldn't necessarily need a discontinuity to occur via any kind of growth in order to have an existential risk. It might be true that we would have that problem if AI capabilities growth was just fast enough for long enough to outpace our ability to make it safe. And the gap is sufficiently large when capability becomes dangerous. In that scenario, diminishing returns could be reached at some point. But if the progress were sufficiently jarring before that, as AI becomes dangerous, we could be done for.
That's right. And I think that's why, a lot of people have reacted to arguments like this by putting less stock in kind of singularity style scenarios and more stock in more mundane scenarios, I guess like person of interest style scenarios in which you have a computer growing at a normal pace to be rather intelligent and acting in agentic ways to manipulate people and gain power and gain money and seize power. And these I like because they're much more, well, first likely, but also much more empirically tractable. And again, these are things that we can, I think, make much more progress on in thinking about, as it were, like socio-technical AI safety, grounded in the technology, grounded in the society. It's just, it is actually going to require a lot of detailed argument about how an AI is going to misbehave and what it's going to do and how it's going to pull it off.
Next question is, if we have diminishing returns on AI research, can't that be offset by increasing the number of AI researchers by orders of magnitude? Or do you expect that then it would be run into other bottlenecks such as hardware? If that's not an issue, is it possible in principle?
Yeah, totally possible in principle. Of course, it's even possible in principle there weren't diminishing returns. And this is in general why I say I don't want to lean on any one argument. It's just like, look, we're not talking about, hyperbolic growth in hardware. We're talking about maybe hyperbolic or more than hyperbolic growth in hardware against it getting much harder to innovate in hardware. And of course, if you keep throwing more things at it, you can usually get away with it for a while. But I hope the Moore's Law story is suggestive of the fact that throwing more resources at something only works for so long. That is, $10 billion for a semiconductor plant is not the limit, but 10 trillion might be. And the whole let's just keep throwing resources at it, you do run out of resources, even if you're very rich.
Wouldn't all the things you just mentioned that would change your mind be realized too late in any case in which they are relevant?
I think some effective altruists have um, much quicker timelines than some others. I think people are really worried about computers within a year or, 2 years going from a state that's really quite non-threatening to a state that is quite world-shattering. I think probably pushback on singularity style worries should make us a little bit more skeptical of these kinds of growth trends because they tend to be pretty fast growth stories. I think certainly if you have a fast growth story, you think we need to act right now before it's too late, and you're really frustrated by people stopping and waiting for evidence. Of course, Yudkowsky, I mean, I know he retracted it. He did give a date for the singularity, and it passed. So I think sometimes we can be a little bit too quick with these things.
The next question. Is the singularity hypothesis necessary to the AI risk argument? Does it add anything besides positing that eventually AI will get to level X?
It adds the not talking, having to talk about anything but motivation. So when you get, the AI in a box mailing in a sample of DNA that, when synthesized, creates nanobots that go take over the world, that kind of, Bostrom-Yudkowsky argument is not going to work without a very aggressive singularity style worry. And so you get into a place where you really need to do much more, technical and empirical thinking about the kinds of power seeking you're going to get and how they're going to happen. And of course, you can totally do those without the singularity hypothesis. It's just, you lose that. And again, you lose the it's going to happen too fast for us to react worry.
Next question, but what if the top of the tan H is high enough to do those extraordinary things?
Um, I'm not sure what to say. I mean, of course, if we're talking about what's going to happen in a million years, that's probably a worry that a lot of people share. And, a lot of species don't make it that long. If the thought is we're going to get quite quickly to that top, I think you're going to start owing a story about how we're going to get, the power and the energy and the researchers and overcome some of the trends, scaling laws slowing down and research productivity breaking. But if you want to make the time horizon long enough, I think this is one of many worries that people have about the longevity of the human species. And, it's not crazy to worry that most species don't make it a million years. Is that true? Many don't.
Last question here. Oh, two questions. The shape of the curve still seems like the wrong question for safety. You could have logarithmic growth and still end up with superintelligence in a few years.
Wait, what? No, 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 no. Sorry, we are right now on a path where we have exponential hardware growth, at best linear intelligence growth, and nobody thinks this is a path that's going to put us to. I've never seen a model that has sublinear growth getting us super intelligence in a couple years. Like maybe you just have a model where we're almost already there already. But even like that model is going to be a little bit worrying because if you think we're almost already there already, so we're going to get super intelligence in a couple years because we just need to tick up a little, then you have to say, okay, now we have a machine that's not that threatening, but we're almost there. And if we just go a little further, we're all going to die. And that becomes like much harder to run. I don't think you're going to be able to ground most risk worries with sublinear growth on anything like a timeline of, a couple years or a couple decades. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen any models trying to do that.
One last question I think we have time for. What if we do not need massively more compute than we already do, and instead the changes will be conceptual, architectural?
Yeah, so that's an argument people make. So like Nick Bostrom says, what if, 10 or 12 hackers in a basement are just going to kick us up to super intelligence? And certainly we have seen things like transformer architectures be quite important in terms of changes. I guess one worry here is this becomes a little bit like a restatement of the worry. Like, of course, the worry is like, what if we suddenly jump to superintelligence? But we don't have a mechanism. I guess the second worry is you're abandoning the plausible part of the singularity, which was supposed to give you a mechanism that was self-improvement. You just have to make yourself a little better, a little better, a little better. And these, as it were, some smart human makes a rapid innovation stories, or maybe dropping the self-improvement that was supposed to be the mechanism. And maybe the last thing, if you're sold on anything like the bitter lesson, I think a lot of people think that, of course, there are things you can do with software, but in the long run, the trend of hardware, the trend of computing performance are pretty similar. And so even as we're impressed that, the trend is a little bit nonlinear because we have software innovations, we could not have had transformers in the 60s doing what they're doing now. And so I think there's probably going to be some hardware demands on what you can do with software.
Great. Well, David, thank you so much. I'm so glad that we were able to get you back on here to answer some of these questions. If you all have any more questions for David, he's going to be having office hours in about 10 minutes, I believe. So go ahead and jump over there to ask whatever questions we didn't get to. But thank you very much. I really appreciate your perspective and thank everybody for attending and all the questions. Have a good rest of your day. Good conference.